Thank you so much for giving of your time to be with us today. My name is Jennifer McGuffin. I am the Chief Communications Officer at Romanucci Blandin. On behalf of Tony Romanucci and Stefan Blandin, this is the power spot, right? Right? I got them both right there. We are so glad that you're here, and we hope that this is a valuable conversation today. But as you will see by the end of our event, we don't want it to just end here. We have handpicked all of you to be here because we see you, we respect your work, and we believe that we are aligned in a number of important ways. We hope that this is rocket fuel for the work we are all doing, and that there is shared interest and energy coming out of today. With that, first I would like to start by recognizing the elected officials in the room. We have several, and it's important to be admiring of their service to our community. First, Attorney General Kwame Raoul, and if you could please stand. Representative Tracy Katz-Mule, I know was going to be a minute late. I don't think she's made it into the room. Representative Bob Morgan. Our own Gina DeBoni, our managing partner, who is a trustee for the Village of Glenview. Alderperson Maria Haddon. Representative Kelly Cassidy. Thank you so much. And full disclosure, there are members of the media in the room. I don't want anybody going home and say, oh my goodness, what did I say? And who is sitting next to me? So I'd like to acknowledge those journalists in the room. This is an on-the-record event. For starters, did Shia Kapos make it into the room? I hadn't seen her name tag get picked up. Okay. We have Brandis Friedman from Channel 11. Grace Barbick from the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Emily Horner from the Chicago Tribune. I believe we were expecting. Has she arrived yet? Okay, so there may be an entrance or two in the next few minutes, but thank you, each of you, to being here. I would also like to refer to you to your program for extended bios for our esteemed panelists. Reading each of their bios would take an hour in and of itself for each one. They all have legendary careers. They have contributed greatly to our community, to our state, to our country. Please do take the time to read, and they each have our respect and our thanks for their work. Our first panel will focus on the current state of racial bias in policing, the challenge of public discussion, and the path to change. It will be moderated by Antonio Romanucci, and I'm going to turn it over to him from here.
I tried my best this morning to get around to meeting everybody here. And for those of you that I didn't meet, it's just because I didn't have enough time before we started. So I will meet you before the day is over. But this is not our first time doing this type of presentation. Romanucci Blandin has done this several times, but we took a pandemic vacation and we're back. But we've decided to do it in a much different format, a smaller format, fewer people, and having our panels up here together at once as opposed to spread out over a 4 or 5 hour day. So today's presentation will be shorter, it's smaller, and we hope more dynamic, and it will come with more ideas. And you have to ask yourself, well, why are you doing this? Well, the whole, Perry, where are you? Perry Irmer, you came from France, so I'll invoke your words. The whole raison d'etre of us being here, participating in this panel, is the work that Stefan and I have been doing for the past 2.5 decades, and what we've immersed ourselves in. What we've come to see is that really our work, the people that we represent, that we try to do good for, is really as a result of bias that exists. When you look at, if we were to share the same table, well, you know, people will say, well, Tony, you do so much of the civil rights and policing side. That's true. And then they know Stefan to do the medical side of our office. But no matter whether it's policing or medicine, there is inherent bias in how police treat people or how medicine treats people. And what we're trying to do, our whole goal here is to flatten that curve. We don't want there to be bias. We don't want there to be differences. One of the things that I lead off with when I talk about whether it's Rodney King or George Floyd or more recently Tyree Nichols is that when 250 years ago, when our Constitution was written and our amendments were formed thereafter, there was a saying that it was life, liberty, and we can all finish it, and justice for all. What you notice is that it's not life, liberty, or justice, it's all three. Every single one of us in this room and every single person walking across those bridges or driving in a car is entitled to all three under our governing Constitution. It's not an or. We're entitled to all three. And that's why I'm so passionate about what we do, because I want to see that carried out in everyday life. I wanted to see it happen. You know, what Stephan, you and I, when we have our talks, we say, what next? What next practice area are we going to put ourselves out of business for? That's the goal. For litigators, the goal is to find the practice area that you can extinguish and then move on to a different one where we can make better. I am going to refer to our general now, Kwame Raoul, because when you look at the role of the generals across our country, and especially for what he's been doing in Illinois, they are also our gatekeepers. I mean, I don't even know where to start with the litigation that he's been involved in or started, whether it's opioids or e-cigarettes or social media. Yesterday, announcing that great lawsuit against TikTok for digital addiction. Think about what social media, how it's transformed our youth and how it's taken them from a position of not having body dysmorphia or suicidal tendencies, all because of using your index finger to scroll. So that's why we're here today, and that's what we hope to accomplish by the end of today, is we're not going to solve the problem, but we want to transform what we're doing so that we can keep flattening the curve and making sure that everyone has life, liberty, and justice, and not make it an or. So that's what I can think of what I had off the top of my head, and that's probably a good thing because I know we're on schedule. So we're going to move forward, and I do want to make some short introductions. To my immediate right is another one of our partners at R&B, which is Bhavani Ravindran. Bhavani, thank you for being here. So Bhavani is just absolutely integral to the civil rights team at Romanucci and Blandin. And I'm very, very proud of our civil rights team because I brag about them. And I brag and I say our civil rights team is as big as many PI firms in the city. We have a very robust, dedicated civil rights team. And for those who are on the civil rights team, if you're here, stand up because you need to be acknowledged. I know Sam, Patrick, Josh, Stephen, thank you so much. We are so passionate with what we do, and Bhavani was right there when I tell you ground zero when we got retained on the George Floyd case, and I gave Bhavani the impossible task. And if you're in litigation, you know how impossible this is, but she did it. She led the team that did it. I said, Bhavani, and this was on probably May 28th, 3 days after George was murdered. I said, Bhavani, you've got 30 days to figure out how to get this case ready for trial. It was impossible, but she did it. And next, I already gave a little bit of a brief intro on our general, Kwame Raoul. We laughed a little bit before we started this today because there was some time where I was seeing him every day, especially during DNC. It's like we were running into each other every day, but now it's only every week, so I know that we miss each other dearly. But the reason that we run into each other so much is because there are parallel lives with what we do. Clearly, the general is far more important with what he does, leading, being the representative for the people of the state of Illinois and being our #1 gatekeeper. Well, we're also gatekeepers, but on a much smaller scale. And so we are ever grateful to you, General Raoul, for your work, your dedication, and your passion for what you do. Next, we have Robert Klemko. Robert may stand up if you don't mind. So if you haven't met Robert, Robert is a member of the media. I don't know if Jen actually introduced him, but Robert is a member of the media, and I've gotten to know him quite well over time because he is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. And Robert has covered many of the cases that, for example, our civil rights team covers. And having Robert here is invaluable because he's an in-depth reporter. He's not a daily beat reporter, so he really deep dives into a lot of the issues. And I think he can bring some tremendous foundation to what we're doing today. So thank you for being here, Robert. And then last is my really good friend now, Anjanette Young. Anjanette, stand up, take a bow, please. You know, I almost feel embarrassed introducing Anjanette this way, but I have to because of who she is now as a result of the injustice that happened to her when somebody tried to take her liberty away, when somebody tried to do injustice to her. Anjanette was part of the wrong raid that happened about 5 years ago when Chicago police went to her home, wrong address, and she had just come home from work, and they detained her in a not appropriate way. And Anjanette, since then, and she'll tell you more of her story, has become literally, I think, one of the city's greatest now new activist who is out there literally stumping day in and day out for people's rights. She is the one that's out there saying life, liberty, and justice for all. So thank you for being here, Anjanette. I will let my partner introduce the rest of his panel, but I do want to share a special thanks for all of you being here today. You all share a very special role here, and I thank you so much for your time. So I think we're going to start off with each of the panelists giving short, brief introductions, and then I'm going to lead us right into some questions. So Bhavani, if you'd like to take a start, I thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. We thought it would be helpful or maybe interesting to talk through a couple of the cases that we've been working on that we really think showcase the issues in biased policing and how it's still going on. Unfortunately, some of our most recent cases we can't really talk about too much as they're in active litigation. So we are going to talk through some of our other cases that I think show some of the real issues that all of our cases showcase when issues of race are apparent in those cases, and want to make sure that we have a bit of a common ground to talk through some of these issues. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a bit about 3 of our cases that are currently in later stages of litigation that really showcase these issues. So one of our cases is on behalf of the family of Byron Williams. He goes by Ronnie. Byron Williams was the youngest of 9 siblings. His 8 other siblings are in active litigation on his behalf, and we are past the motion for summary judgment stage, which means the last big obstacle the defendants had against us has been moved out of the way, and we are now waiting for a trial date. Now, this case is really a good example of how individuals come into contact with police when they're not really doing anything wrong and how that targets certain individuals. What Ronnie was doing is he was riding his bike around 5:30 a.m., which is right before sunrise in Las Vegas, on a sidewalk, when police officers who are in something called an interdiction unit, or like a street crime unit, where they're just supposed to make contacts with the community in the hopes that it will lessen crime overall, decided that they were going to pull Ronnie over for not having a light on the back of his bicycle. He was riding on a sidewalk. So what happens is that they pull up on him and they do lights and sirens, and he got a little freaked out and he started riding his bicycle faster. Again, they're just looking at this person for not having a light on the back of his bike, and he rides on the sidewalks and cuts through a gas station, and they chase him in the vehicle. He gets to a fence and he leaves his bike and he climbs the fence and he begins to run. And so the officers pull the car over, jump out of the car, and start pursuing him. Ronnie runs about a half a block, and then he lays down and he says, I give up, just take me in. And the officers proceed to put weight on his back, his head, his shoulders, his arms. They pull them back behind him. They handcuff him. And as soon as Ronnie goes down, he starts saying that he can't breathe. And he ends up saying it over 24 times. An officer's response to that is to say, he has incarceritis, which is a joking way to say, you're pretending to be ill, so we don't take you to jail, that kind of thing. They're high-fiving for catching him. They're saying to each other, I can't breathe either. That was quite the run you gave us, things like that. Meanwhile, Ronnie is fighting for his life in front of their eyes, and they're not doing anything about it. About 2.5 minutes after this, after he lays down and starts to say he can't breathe, a female officer arrives and says, hey, maybe we should call an ambulance. So they call an ambulance because he can't breathe, or he's saying that. And then they proceed to drag him to 2 different locations, not pick him up, but physically drag him. And then they leave him face down in 2 different locations over the course of about a 15-minute period before EMTs arrive. And during that time, they are high-fiving still, congratulating each other, joking. And a man has literally told them he can't breathe and is laying in front of them. We litigated that case. We took many, many depositions, and it revealed over time that these officers had not been trained on positional restraints. They had not been trained on the recovery position, where you put someone on their side, something we've all known about since we went to college parties. Someone drank a lot, you put them on their side so they can breathe better and they won't choke. Those are things that these officers just didn't know to utilize. But what became most disturbing is just the dehumanizing and self-congratulatory attitude that the officers took. And we have so much video footage from this, despite the fact that they turned body-worn cameras on and off. And eventually, the only thing they were disciplined for was that body-worn camera usage. And the only reason we even know that this incident was what it was is that the medical examiner actually got a video of what was happening and was able to list positional restraint as a cause of death. So that's just really one of those cases that, I won't say it stands out because unfortunately it's a frequent occurrence, but it's something that showcases how small the interaction might begin with, something we've probably all done. Who hasn't jaywalked or dropped a piece of paper from their pocket, but why are certain people being targeted for these really inconsequential issues? A bike light that's not on a bike moments before sunrise does not really seem like something you need to stop someone for. In Las Vegas, it's literally called Sin City, and we're stopping someone for riding on a sidewalk. So another case, and I'm gonna try to be a little faster, I feel like I'm talking a lot. It's hard once you get into these cases, is to Cynthia Clements. This incident happened in Elgin, and we are still litigating this case. This case is, they're all tragic, so it's hard to say. This isn't the most tragic case. They're all incredibly tragic. This is just a very sad incident. We've known the family for a long time, so I feel very emotionally tied to these cases sometimes. But Ms. Clements was in her own car, just pulled over on the side of the road, doing nothing illegal, when an officer decided to just follow her vehicle around and try to make contact with her because she had a lot of things in her vehicle. And so she pulls past a stop sign eventually. So then the officer, does lights and sirens, but she pulls past a stop sign near Beverly Road and Elgin, if anyone knows that area, and enters onto 90. So the officer doesn't pursue onto the highway for a stop sign issue. He lets it go, but later on she's spotted, pulled over on the side of 90 with 4 blown out tires, and officers begin to approach and try to communicate with her. What becomes apparent is that DeCynthia is self-harming with a small kitchen knife, not a butcher knife, a very small knife, and that she is taking substances and having some kind of a mental health breakdown. So officers can't really communicate with her, but over what ends up being an hour and a half, they bring in officer after officer after officer. They create a plan about how they're going to get her out of the vehicle. And then they just get impatient. They've got 2 rifles on scene, a K-9 unit. They've got something called a pepper ball, which is shoots a 40 millimeter canister of pepper spray at someone. So it's a less lethal weapon. It doesn't take someone's life. And they've got about, I would say, 5 or 6 different less lethal options on scene, but they get impatient because she's on 90 and it is the middle of the night and they're afraid traffic is going to start. So they pin the car in with 2 police vehicles, one in the front and one in the back, physically touching DeCynthia's vehicle. And she's already shown that she's having a mental health breakdown, that she is self-harming. So she ends up lighting a fire in the vehicle, and it starts to really harm her. And she simultaneously has a knife and is self-harming. That's all they've seen. They haven't seen anything violent to anyone else. They haven't seen her commit any crime besides the stop sign and having a stalled car on 90, which last I checked, not a crime. And so eventually the smoke is coming out of the car and the police are on the other side of the barricade in the highway. They're some distance away from her. They decide to jump the wall and come onto the side of the barricade that's within feet of her door. And she eventually opens the door because of the smoke. And they're yelling, DeCynthia, come out, come out, come out. They're not telling her to drop the knife. Maybe one officer says it, but mostly they're just yelling for her to get out of there. And they've got 4 or 5 officers, 2 just with hands, 2 with tasers, 1 with a firearm. She takes 1 step out, and the officer armed with a firearm shoots 1 bullet. He hits her in the head, and she dies almost instantly. And again, after this happens, we see the officers dragging her body. Someone went to check for a pulse, and the shooting officer says, she's dead, bro. Just a horrifying situation made worse by the most dehumanizing language you could ever hear. And then on top of that, and this kind of was happening simultaneously in the news, is there was an incident involving a 19-year-old white woman who had stolen a machete from Walmart, and you may have remembered the story. She ended up killing her Uber driver. Officers in Lincolnwood took her unharmed. She wouldn't drop the machete. They tased her. They took her in. She's now serving a prison sentence. Now you talk about that distinction. You've got DeCynthia Clements, who is a teeny tiny black woman who had committed no violent crimes, who is taken in the way that she was. So I think that it always struck me that those 2 stories were hitting the news at the same time, because someone with a machete who wouldn't drop it is considered less of a threat than someone who's only been hurting herself. And so it just, to me, shows that stark contrast. And then lastly, really quickly, wanted to mention the Maurice Granton case, which happened in June of 2018 in Chicago. Maurice was spotted on a cam. I'm going to go really fast on this one, by police officers. He was seen with, at most, a small bag of marijuana on him, and he was touching a pocket. So the sergeant called in officers to come into the scene because he said there might be a gun in that pocket. So for those reasons alone, they come to the scene. Maurice sees police coming, and probably because he had a single dime bag of weed in his pocket, he decided to run, and he did. And officers gave chase. They lost sight of him, and then a gunshot is heard within a mile radius of this incident. And we know because of ShotSpotter, and I'm sure people are familiar with ShotSpotter, it's very inaccurate, but regardless, ShotSpotter made it seem like there was a gun in the area. And so an officer who loses sight of Maurice rounds a corner, sees Maurice, grab hold of a fence with both hands, a chain link fence. He tries to climb the chain link fence. The officer discharges his firearm, killing Maurice at point blank range with clearly no weapon in his hands. And again, we see this dehumanizing behavior because after Maurice is shot and he is on the ground, it's one of the saddest videos where you see someone struggling after being hit fatally. And the officer says to the gathering crowd, because this is in broad daylight, you see your homie, and points at Maurice struggling on the ground. And again, we have, in the city of Chicago, we don't need to chase people for a dime bag of weed. That is just so unnecessary. So I will stop there because I feel like I've talked way too much, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Bhavani. General Raul, if I could turn it over to you. And before I do that, I just wanted to point out one other, important gatekeeping function that you've performed for our people in the state of Illinois, along with Representative Morgan and our entire state, and that's fighting for this ban on assault weapons. So I just wanted to just give a personal thank you on behalf of all of us for keeping us safe. Representative Morgan, thank you so much. General Raul, thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for your partnership and working with our office on some of the aspects of our implementation of the consent decree with the Chicago Police Department. Let me start by just talking about who the Illinois Attorney General's office is not. Because there's often times when there's an injustice in policing, there are all sorts of calls from the public for my office to respond to an individual case in the same manner that perhaps the Department of Justice might with a civil rights case or investigation. That's not our domain, right? The individual cases. We do prosecute certain cases, but the majority of the times when we are prosecuting cases, we're stepping in the place of the local state's attorney because of conflict, or in rare cases, it may evolve from a case that we're investigating. Where we do come into play are two different places. One, I came to the Attorney General's office by way of 14 years in the state legislature, and when I came in, people said, "Are you going to miss the legislature?" And I said, "No, because I don't have a vote, but I remain engaged with the legislature." So our advocacy for laws to respond to bring about constitutional policing is one of the ways that we engage. And there's an aspect to the Safety Act that most people don't think about when you think about the overall Safety Act, and that was a component that brought about, well, a couple aspects to it. One, that a component that brought about patterns, authority for my office to engage in patterns and practices, investigations of police departments where there's allegations of systemic problems, not just a one incident, but systemic problems of unconstitutional policing. Two, and it's interesting how this came about, and unfortunately, usually when we have real movement in policy, it comes on the heels of a tragedy, right? So our first attempt to take a bite out of law enforcement reform came on the heels of the Laquan McDonald shooting, and we implemented some changes, but one of the things we started to discuss at the time was the notion of police licensing or more robust decertification components in our statute. It was the law that the only way that you can be decertified as a police officer is that you were convicted of a felony or certain serious, like sex-related misdemeanors. Much more conservative states had more robust decertification statutes, but the state of Illinois was really, really lagging. One of my former colleagues, by the name of Tim Bivens, who's a very, he and I were probably on the polar opposite of the spectrum of policy, and he's a really conservative guy, but we were friends, right? And he was a former county sheriff. And he had the experience of trying to fire a bad deputy and having that deputy sent back to them because of arbitrator sending them back. So he introduced a bill to bring about police licensing. He only got two co-sponsors on that bill in the Senate at the time. One was John Milner, who was a former police chief, and me. Both Democrats and Republicans shied away from the bill at the time. On the heels of George Floyd's murder, I called Tim and I said, hey, I'd like to reignite your concept of licensing, but I want it to be law enforcement driven. And I want the sheriffs at the table. And Kelly's here and Bob's here. They know the challenge of getting the Sheriff Association to advocate for any type of reform. So I said, in order for them to come to the table, they're not going to come if I call them. I want you to call them. And it was Tim Bivens that called the Sheriff's Association. Then I called John Milner. I said, I want the police chiefs at the table. And so I had John Milner, and these are two Republicans, and asked him to get the police chiefs at the table. I have a good relationship with Bob Berlin, who is the DuPage County state's attorney. I said, I want the state's attorneys at the table. And we had a series of over 25 meetings working on creating a more robust decertification statute that was rolled into the Safety Act. And then again, the Patterns and Practice Investigation Authority was something we asked for. Concurrently, Congress was at least discussing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And a component that they did not have in there, in the original introduced bill, was giving authority to state attorneys general to do the patterns and practice investigations that the Department of Justice get to do. Speaking of the Department of Justice, it was on the heels of Laquan McDonald's murder that the Department of Justice began investigating the Chicago Police Department, consistently on the heels of a tragedy that action happens. So they, under Loretta Lynch, they conducted an investigation. She concluded her investigation just as Donald Trump was assuming the presidency, and Jeff Sessions came in as the Attorney General. And Jeff Sessions said, "Oh, that's none of our business. We don't want to do anything with this." And it was my predecessor, Lisa Madigan, through parens patriae theory, who filed an action that has led to the consent decree that we now have with the Chicago Police Department, and she passed the baton to me. It was just as I was assuming office that the implementation stage of the consent decree began. And it's really comprehensive. When you have time, I suggest you actually read through the consent decree, because some thought, oh, this is a process we can just go through in a year or two, but it was, I think, the most important three words in the order that Judge Dow entered for the consent decree were the last three words of the order, and it was, "Let us begin." The message sent in those three words is this is going to be a long process if we're going to do it right. It's not something, and I remember Judge Dow, who's now at the Supreme Court, staffing Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, he called me in once and he wanted to see what my attitude towards the consent decree was going to be. And the message that I kept on delivering is that we don't want this to be a box-checking exercise. We want a true commitment to change in terms of de-escalation, use of force. We incorporated, again, on the heels of a tragedy that happened to Ms. Young, wrong raids and warrant policy, foot pursuit policy. You could think of all of the events that lead to us digging deeper and incorporating more into the consent decree implementation process. And it's been at times like pulling teeth, because you don't go beyond checking boxes if you don't have commitment in the leadership of the Chicago Police Department. We're at a good stage now. I think Larry Snelling is a welcomed change. He's a national expert on use of force, and he truly believes in the process. That doesn't mean that we don't have disagreements along the way, but there's a different commitment into this implementation of the consent decree now than we experienced with the maybe 5 different superintendents that I've had to deal with over the course of the implementation stage. You know, dealing with 5 is a problem in itself, right? The change of leadership. But I think we're at a good stage. As a result of the, I'll conclude by saying, as a result of the legislature giving us patterns and practice investigative authority, maybe about a year and a half ago, we initiated a patterns and practice investigation into the Joliet Police Department. It's still ongoing. Don't start referring a whole bunch of police departments to us, because it is really difficult and involved work that takes time if you're doing it right. But I have an incredible staff that's really committed to this work. And I really believe the process that we're going through with the Chicago Police Department is not only critical to the city of Chicago, but this is an opportunity to have a demonstration project for the country on how you implement constitutional policing. So if we can do it right in Chicago, and the DNC was a good example of how much we've evolved in terms of constitutional policing. How the law enforcement engaged with protesters during the DNC was dramatically different than what would have occurred even 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you, General Raoul. I want to just let the audience know. I want to throw in a couple of nuggets here. You know, General Raoul talked about police departments, you know, county departments. Does anybody know how many different type of police agencies there are in this country? How many? Anybody want to raise their hand and take one guess, and then I'll tell you that you're wrong. No, you can't, because you know.
How many there are?
Yeah.
Over 16,000?
You are pretty darn close. Last I saw, there were nearly 18,000 different police agencies in this country, all with different rules and regulations. So, Robert, I want to give you and Anjanette, be respectful, but keep your remarks, because I have some questions, and I know the audience will, because my questions, I think, will help get us to some meaningful discussion points.
Sure, yeah, I'll be brief. This is about the current state of racial bias in policing, the challenge of public discussion, and the path to change. I gather that I'm here to talk about the challenge of public discussion. I cover criminal justice for the Washington Post on the national security team. And as Tony said, I do mostly long-form articles, so I have the luxury of being able to spend a long time on a story before I have to actually turn anything in. It's a job that's becoming more and more rare in our media environment. I have up here a map of Mississippi from the Northwestern University website. They keep track of a new term that was invented in the last several years called news deserts. Many of you have heard of food deserts. There are now news deserts because of our shifting media environment. Northwestern says over 200 counties in the United States are considered news deserts because they do not have, or they have limited access to reliable news. I was recently in Mississippi writing about the Lexington, Mississippi Police Department. It's a town of about, I think, maybe 1,400 people. They've got 4 stoplights, and they've got a police department with about 10, 15 people with a record of terrorizing black citizens. When I went there, the DOJ had announced an investigation into this tiny town. They rarely look into towns this small, and it was because the ACLU had sued them, and two separate civil rights attorneys had sued them over various Fourth Amendment abuses, excessive force, sexual harassment, accusations of rape on behalf of officers, you name it. As a news nerd and a journalism professor at American University, I'm always curious about the state of journalism in the places I go, especially these small towns. So I stopped by the Holmes County Herald, which you'll see there as the only news organization serving Holmes County, which is a newspaper, small little newspaper based in Lexington, staff of about 4 or 5 people. And I was looking at recent issues of the Holmes County Herald, and I couldn't find anything about this DOJ investigation. So I stopped and talked to the publisher, who was also the managing editor, and I interviewed her, and I said, you know, I can't find anything about this DOJ investigation in your paper. Are there some back copies you can show me? And she said, well, I haven't written about it. And I said, why? You know, the DOJ is here in town. The investigators are here. They're shadowing the cops. They're looking through the files. Why haven't you written about it? She said, well, you know, we just don't want to be political. The newspaper. So they'd written one article about it when it was announced, and she said that the next time they covered it would probably be if any charges were filed or if anybody was arrested. But until then, they just didn't want to get too political. Now, that is the only newspaper in Holmes County, the only newspaper serving this community of 1,500 people in Lexington who are being abused allegedly by their police department. And Holmes County is not considered a news desert. There are over 200 news deserts that have less access to reliable news than Holmes County, where the Holmes County Herald is not political. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to talk briefly about the promise of body cameras and what's happened since. A 2016 survey found that 47% of law enforcement agencies had acquired body-worn cameras. About 62% of local police departments deployed body-worn cameras in 2020. So that number continues to rise. There was the expectation that this would create a new era of transparency, aided by an aggressive media contingent that would publish body camera videos. The results were that multiple studies found that body-worn cameras did not have a statistically significant impact on officers' use of force. And just taking a sample of 1 month, in June 2022, ProPublica counted 79 killings with body camera footage. A year and a half later, the police had released footage in just 33 cases. So what happened? Well, NIJ did a poll of police departments, and they found that 66% of police departments had written policies or directives concerning body-worn cameras. So that means a third just had body-worn cameras, but no policies or rules regarding them. After George Floyd's killing, the NYPD said it would publish footage of so-called critical incidents within 30 days. There were 380 of those incidents. By December 2023, the department had released the footage within a month, just twice. Some states do not consider body cameras part of the public record. Lexington, Mississippi, somehow has body cameras. The DOJ went down there and they were shocked to find thousands of hours of video of officers violating people's rights. They recorded themselves violating people's rights because they did not know the law. They did not know, in many cases, that they were breaking the law. How many hours of body camera footage, how many incidents of body camera footage do you think the Holmes County Herald published? 0. Neither did the Jackson TV stations that are 40 minutes away. So you have a police culture that is largely averse to transparency and a media environment that is either unwilling or unable to seek transparency. So as media organizations die, the values that were once priorities, fairness, accuracy, holding people accountable, have begun to fade, and media organizations try to remedy the thing that's killing us. We try to be faster than the rest of the internet. I won't go too deeply into this slide. You can take a look at it, but some researchers did a study of closed captioning of local TV broadcasts concerning shootings, crime, police action, and they found that the TV stations were way more likely to use obfuscatory language meant to confuse when a police officer shot at or killed a person. And they were far more likely to use the language that we all use, the way we all speak, when a person is a suspect of violence. So you will see often in the news, a suspect killed a person, but you will rarely see in the news, a police officer killed a person. You will see more likely a person was killed in an officer-involved shooting. That's language invented by police, taught by police. If you go to policing conventions, you can find a class on media relations, and they tell you how to talk like this in ways that people do not talk. I don't know what the answer is. I know that traditional legacy media has not delivered on the promise of transparency and the values that we once represented. And that's not just the tiny Holmes County Herald, that's newspapers and TV stations, large and small, from Washington, D.C. to Mississippi. I learned about your case, ma'am, recently, and I think that what you have done in the way that you have told your story far and wide and gained the kind of influence that you have is part of the answer to all of this. Because I think that when victims stand up and they begin to represent themselves in the media and they begin to self-publish and they go around TV stations and newspapers, it forces us to wake up.
Thank you, Robert. So when you think about the clear and present danger that a department like Lexington poses not only to its own citizens, but to the entire country, because they were able to literally get away with it. I'm somewhat familiar with Lexington, Robert, because all the police officers were in on the gig. They were all able to employ their code of silence, and they were all able to violate people's constitutional rights because it was it a 10-member department?
Yeah, a little more than that.
Okay, 10 to 12-member department, so it was easy for them to cover everything up and take part in the unconstitutional and biased policing. And so Lexington, unfortunately, is only a blip on the radar. There are about 14 other cities who are under a consent decree, right? Chicago being one of them, Baltimore, New Orleans, Minneapolis is under consent. Memphis, I'm sure, will soon be under some sort of either their consent or they'll get sued for it. So there are about 15 other departments across the country that are currently under consent. So last, I want to introduce Ann Jeanette. Ann Jeanette, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to tell us a little bit about your story, and then I have some questions.
Yes, thank you, and I understand we're under time, so I'm going to be quick. Next slide, please. So I want to tell you guys how I end up in this space. you've all seen some media of it or heard the story, but in February of 2019, the City of Chicago Police Department raided my home, bad information. And so I'm gonna quickly talk about what I think led them to my home and led them to not believe me after I said 43 times standing in the nude that you have the wrong place. So where I lived at that time was called West Haven Park Apartments. If we go back about 30 years, it used to be called Horner Homes. And the history of Henry Horner Homes was that the police had this very antagonistic relationship with that community. And so it was led by gangs, and there was a lot of violence in the community. And so the police in that community was always, getting into it. And I believe because of the biased culture that we have in our policing system, that the police department that raided my home still had a culture and a belief of what the Henry Hornet homes used to look like, right? So in 2011, I believe it was, through CHA, the residents, they filed a lawsuit, then they turned that Henry Hornets, tore it down, turned it into these now nice mixed income homes that they promoted on the edge of the West Loop and the beautiful, downtown area, right? It's what drew me to the area. I moved in that area in 2013, and this happened in 2019. But because of the previous culture of that community, I believe the police still considers that. And that's one of the reasons why we have these issues of police culture being so deeply rooted against Black and brown communities. Next slide. And so I'm gonna quickly walk you through this timeline, which just this week, we're standing on the 10-year anniversary of Laquan McDonald, right? We all know that, so that was about 10 years ago. And so the consent decree was put in place in 2017. Now, I disagree just a little bit with our general regarding this consent decree, and I hope that he and I can work a little bit more on this. I believe the consent decree is a piece of paper that is useless, and that's from Anjanette Young. And so I'm saying that to say that over the years, I have attended public hearings at the federal law building when they have public hearings about the consent decree. What has happened between 2017 and 2019 before my raid, and what has happened in 2017 till today has been very little action has happened. Now, I understand what the general is saying, like, because we want to get this right, it takes time. But I'll say to him and you all the same thing that I've said to the federal judge. People like me are tired of waiting, right? We don't have time for the police department to continue to operate in the manner that they're operating when people like myself and other families are still being harmed while we're trying to get it right with the consent decree. So I hope that we can start to move a little bit faster and start to see some of these tangible things that are in the consent decree actually happening and seeing results from it, so individuals like myself don't continue to have to live in fear and not trust or feel safe with the police department that is paid to serve and protect us. I have a few more points. So around 2020, some of the things that happened, right? My home's raided, we filed a lawsuit, and then I have a personal experience of how the city covers up and lies about everything. And so that was my experience, and what Robert said about journalism, right? All of the information was hid, right? So the city refused FOIAs. They're not supposed to do that, but they did in my case. They refused it 3 times, actually, before we were able to get body cam footage. And then when we did get the body cam footage and attempted to move forward in the story, and the city goes to federal court and try to stop the story from airing. So these are all the things that are problems when I speak to a crowd like this, and I'm thinking about our legislator and the people in this room who can make policy changes. These are the type of things that we need to look at, speaking from someone in a lived experience. And so then the body cam footage comes out, and the world goes crazy, and rightly so. But no one believed me before the body cam footage, and that shouldn't be the case. And so that's how I find myself in this space now. I truly believe that me not getting killed that night the same way Breonna Taylor did was because I'm supposed to be here today to tell all of you guys why it's important as legislators that we get together and do this work to change the system on how the police interact with our Black and brown communities. And so I've been doing this now for about 5 years. Many of you in this room have been in your elective official roles for 5 years. So I say to you, what have you done in the last 5 years to make the change on what myself and others are constantly asking? And you don't have to answer that. That's a reflective question. Could you do more? Have you done enough? And I say to you, and I'll end with this, is that I hope that I can speak with each of you after this, and we can talk about how do we make change in the next 5 years.
And Jeanette, you know, you talk about how it's going. I don't know if you're a member of my club yet, but you can. I have a club that it's called the Whatever It Takes Club. You and I, you're member number 2.
All right.
We're gonna do it. So thank you all. I do want to ask some questions. I'm going to start with our general. I'm going to ask you this question, Attorney General Raoul. The consent decree that's currently in place in Chicago, many of us in this room have actually worked on parts of your consent decree to get it in place before Judge Dow and now Judge Pallmeyer. And part of that consent decree deals with the Fourth Amendment principles of stop and frisk. And as you know, that stop and frisk is now part of the consent decree, and we can talk about the statistical numbers, how abhorrent they were, that over a 5-year period, there were 2 million unconstitutional stops in the city of Chicago that resulted in 0 arrests. 2 million stops. 2 million. The period, the data period, and I'm sure Karen or Josh can correct me, the data period was 2011 through 2015, 2 million stops. In the city, I don't remember what the population was at that time, but I can tell you there were 800,000, 72% of the 2 million were black stops. Right, about that, 800,000. So there were multiple stops of multiple people. So now it seems that there's a slippery slope. Now it seems that CPD has moved away from stop and frisk and now has concentrated its efforts more on traffic stops. Maybe it's just my own perception, but I seem to see it a lot more. Traffic stops will lead to the same distrust in the community that street stops took hold of over years and years of time, and because street stops evolve into foot chases. Foot chases evolve into harm, shootings, danger. Traffic stops evolve into car chases. And we all know what the numbers are and what the percentages of car chases that wind up in crashes. And then we have to look to these good people to my left to solve the problems of the people who are hurt or killed in car chases. Will you undertake an investigation of agencies in the state of Illinois who either promulgate an unconstitutional traffic stop policy or zero tolerance policy?
Let me go back to my investigations are always driven by concrete information being brought to our attention. So we don't go on, you mentioned 18,000 police department. I think there were 700 to 900 police departments here in the state of Illinois. So I'm not going to go around to 700 to 900 police departments and look for, and I don't have the resources to do that. But certainly, if there's evidence of systemic problems in any police department within the state, to the extent of our capacity, one of the things is I'm often in touch with the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice was very supportive of the notion of state attorneys general having patterns and practice investigative authority, because the Department of Justice doesn't have the bandwidth to do the investigations of all the police departments that do need to be investigated. And so certainly, with regards to traffic stops, we are in the process of trying to enroll that into the consent decree. And I want to touch on the notion, and I kind of agree, that the consent decree by itself is just a sheet of paper, right? It's just a sheet of paper. But what we're engaged in is the implementation of the consent decree, which involves evaluating policies, developing new policies, and carrying out those policies. And so certainly the short answer to your question is yes, if there's,
Evidence of it,
yeah.
yes.
But I certainly don't have the capacity to just go generally looking for.
Well, and I appreciate that, and you're 100% right. It's a horror that we have to wait for a harm to happen before we can begin the investigation or file the lawsuit or do whatever we need to do. So I appreciate your answer that you are committed to constitutional policing, because the goal today is flattening the curve. We're not going to flatten it all the way down, but we got to figure out a way to start tempering it. So I appreciate.
Tony, if I could just say one more thing.
Yeah.
And it's with regards to the consent decree again. One of the things that we realize and we appreciate is the consent decree is not the cure-all. The consent, even for the Chicago Police Department, the consent decree is not the sole tool to bring about constitutional policing. The judge understands that. All of the parties understand that. We continue to need, law firms and activists and people at large to advocate for policy changes beyond what's in the four corners of the consent decree.
Thank you. The next question is for Robert Klemko, and then I'm going to have a question for Bhavani and Anjanette. I think you two are the bookends on that question. So we have about 5 minutes, so I want to be respectful to our next panel. So keep in mind some of the time. Robert, the media clearly has an important role in reporting when injustice occurs. However, can you talk about the role that media plays when it parrots the narratives that we hear after a police-involved incident? And can you talk a little bit more about your role that you are now undertaking, showing us that slide, how officers are taught to message a certain way and what harms it causes to the community just by being labeled, by being gaslit that way?
Yeah, newspapers, you're old enough to remember when newspapers had something called an ombudsman. Very few of them now, and none at television stations, but there was once this responsibility that media organizations took to where they recognized that the things they reported were just the first draft of history, and that we needed to go back and correct that first draft if something glaring changed. We've stopped doing that, A, because we don't have the resources, B, because I think our answer to the decline in trust in media is to stop acknowledging our own mistakes, which is a mistake. You mentioned these initial reports about, violent incidents, particularly police violence, and often the only narrative that we have at press time is that of the police, because the police union rep is there on the scene and he's talking to the press, and they put out a press release that has this really confusing language. There's really nothing else that we can do in that moment to correct the narrative, as we're still gathering information, but there is this need to put out that initial information. What we have to do, and I think what If I were an activist, the thing that I would try to hold my local media organization accountable to do is to go back and say, well, we had this wrong, and the police told us this wrong. And to hold the police feet to the fire and say, why did you phrase it this way when you knew the truth? Why did you withhold this bit of information when you knew the truth? We don't do that, often because I think media organizations want to maintain that relationship with the police, because the police are the most reliable source that we have. So I think it's a matter of making other sources of information, less biased sources of information, available to the media as early and as often as possible.
Thank you. Bhavani and Anjanette, I want you to take a tag team on this question. Most of us here in this room are from the city of Chicago, and we all know that we very, very, very rarely ever refer to the east side of Chicago, because you're usually swimming. So that leaves us north, west, and south. Bhavani and Anjanette, what are the problems with regard to the definitions of north, west, and south Chicago? How do we move away from the inherent bias, the anchor that exists when police talk about those three districts? So, Bhavani, I'll let you lead, and then Anjanette, you can go forward from there.
Save the really hard questions for the end, Tony. Tony and I were talking about whether our cases ever occur, was it east of Western and north of North Avenue. In the 9 years I've been doing this, I've never handled a case in that quadrant of the city. We get some calls for, I was openly doing illegal drugs in Wrigleyville, and I got arrested, my rights were violated. We get those calls, but not these serious injustices that we see on the west and south sides. The Chicago Police Department's actually getting more and more diverse, and that's probably a good thing. I heard recently that the recruiting classes have more women of color than ever before, and I always think that's a good thing, but we haven't done enough to disengage the system itself to make sure that it's not teaching new recruits to carry on the same traditions of biased policing. That's not really an answer to that question. It's more like a confirmation that that is a problem. Maybe I'll think of something else when I'm speaking, but
Well,
that
you
is,
just said it's confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really just,
Yeah.
that we can hope and help our Attorney General's office and with their work on the consent decree, and we hope that each case will bring light to these injustices. We ask for injunctive relief where we can in these cases, and we have surely made it very, very expensive to police in this way in the city, and we have to hope that over time that's going to make a real change here, but we see that moving very slowly. I'll pass it over to Anjanette.
Yes, I agree that things are moving very slowly. This question is so loaded in so many ways. But the city, I think the city of Chicago is very segregated in the way the communities are designed. And so you have, communities far north who at times may be considered to have a higher social economic status, and then you look at communities on the west and the south side to be less. And so I believe that the police culture also looks at it that way. In my personal experience, I say all the time that it's one thing that they got it wrong and they landed at my door. But it's a different thing of how they treated me once they got on the other side of my door. Those are two different things. And so the way they treated me once they were on the other side of my door, I believe is very indicative of they would have never done that to a woman that was not the same skin color as myself. I just have to believe that that would have never happened to a white woman. And so the police culture is one that needs a lot of work. And I don't know what the answer is, but I would love to see police engage in the community the way they engage police, the way they engage people in their training center. Anybody been to the police department training center? When you walk through there, everything is, yes, ma'am, good morning, sir, right? There's a very respectful way that they engage you in their training center, and I am confused on why that doesn't translate into the community. I mean, they are required to engage you that way when you're at that training center. So why doesn't that happen on the streets? Why can't I be yes, ma'am on the street, but I can be yes, ma'am in a training center? So I think those are some of the things that we need to look at. And we, as new recruits come in and we're trying to shift the culture, I think those are things that need to be looked at.
Thank you, Anjanette. I want to just call out just a couple of people here. There are so many great, great people in this room, and I want to thank our panel for giving us the insight that you've given us today. But we probably have the guru of metrics in this room. Craig Futterman is here today, who, you know, with his laboratory at the University of Chicago has probably literally created the best and most comprehensive database, not only of police misconduct, but of metrics of the things that happen in the city with CPD. So we want to thank you, Craig, for all your work. I want to thank our faith leaders who are in this room, who are an important component of what we're doing. We have the executive director of the DuSable Museum here today. We have lobbyists who are here today. And I wish I could go around the room thanking everyone, but I really am very much appreciative of you all being here today and taking part in this. Thank you.
Let me introduce our second panel. The focus here is racial bias in healthcare and how to overcome it with advocacy, litigation, and other means. And I will tell you, I'll share a very short personal story. I am the immediate past chair of Susan G. Komen's Chicago board. And one of the data points we shared often was, unfortunately, that Black women are 4 times more likely to die from breast cancer than white women. And I think everyone on our next panel will agree. We hope to talk a bit about the root of that absolute disparity and the tragedy because of it. Let me please introduce Stephen Blandin. He has committed his career to delivering justice for victims of negligence, abuse, and wrongful death. His practice is focused on medical malpractice, environmental pollution, construction and workplace accidents, as well as birth injuries, transportation, aviation crashes, and nursing home. And while we're talking about workplace, please shout out to Frank Samario in the back, one of our senior partners who leads our workers' comp practice. Stephen will often say he may not appear to have much in common with Mike Tyson, but he's got this. Mike Tyson is credited with saying that everybody has a plan until they get in the ring, and when they're punched in the face, it becomes a street fight. Stephen understands this thinking and often refers to litigation with insurance companies and corporations as a street fight. He says he always fights like hell because his clients' lives do depend on it, and I can't resist tossing in that because of that fighting spirit in the last 26 years now of Romanucci and Blandin, these two and their attorneys have recovered more than $1 billion for clients. So, Stephen.
So I'm going to hobble up here. I just had hip replacement 3 weeks ago. And I'm one of the beneficiaries of the finest healthcare system in the world. So why do I sue hospitals and doctors? And the short answer is medical malpractice is the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, according to Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. And it's not that doctors are beyond reproach. It's not that doctors are perfect or that we need to hold them to that standard. It's that medicine in the United States of America has become big business. It's a profit-centered industry. And as a result of that, the pressures that are placed upon doctors and hospitals to cut corners, to have volume practices. Mistakes, medical negligence is occurring at a rapid pace. And as Jen pointed out, the disparities are huge. In the socioeconomic space, the quality of care that Black and brown people in the United States receive is widely different from the quality of care that not just white people, but wealthy white people receive. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I grew up in Chicago. I went to Chicago Public Grammar School, high school, went to college here in Chicago, law school here in Chicago. And I thought I had the typical pull yourself up by the bootstraps experience. My family was very poor. I was the beneficiary of welfare and food stamps. My family had very, very difficult circumstances, and as a result, I moved out of my house when I was 16, and I've been supporting myself ever since. So I've been very fortunate. I've had a great career, and I went back to my grammar school about 20 years ago to give the commencement speech, and I was talking to my grammar school kids about, if I can do it, you can do it. And this little 13-year-old boy sitting in the front row raised his hand and said, "But mister, you're white." And it didn't dawn on me, the disparity. I thought that growing up from humble origins, and you could overcome just by hard work alone. And that's not true. And if you look at the city of Chicago, Angelette was talking about this, Bhavani was talking about this. If you look at the city of Chicago and the disparity, you can take a map of the city of Chicago and you can fold it. So whether you're talking about police violence, you're talking about the quality of health care, 2/3 of this city, you can take that map and cut it out. And that's not by accident. This city was set up specifically, it was designed with that in mind. Now, there are people who would stand up and who would say, well, Blandin, you're talking like a woke white person. You're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's all that liberal propaganda. The reason Tony and I are here and the reason our law firm is so successful is because we are dealing with the realities and the fallout from that segregation and that prejudice. And one of the things I want to talk about is how this works and how this impacts in the medical malpractice community, how it works in the medical community in general. And we have some very fine panelists who are going to talk about their experiences and their roles and their involvement in trying to change those things and making this a more fair system, a healthier system for all of us. So the first thing that's on the board is the comment about race and socioeconomic status and how it impacts healthcare. And I don't think there's any question. If you look at the city of Chicago, where do the quality hospitals exist? If you look at the west side and the south side of Chicago, with very few exceptions, they are largely non-existent. If you take a look at the city of Chicago in terms of the quality of care that people receive, it's not just race, but it's the ability to pay for health care. So we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to suffer the consequences of having that level of disparity that's not just along racial lines, but along socioeconomic lines, and all of the fallout that we deal with as a result of having that disparity? One of the experiences that has been changing in the last 20 years of doing this work, and these are my experiences, this is not based on studies, but if you take a look, the perceptions are not just white versus black or white versus brown, but they become tribal in terms of different groups, people who empathize with one another. We are very good at making sure that we include ourselves and exclude other individuals. One of the cases that we had that Mike is going to talk a little bit about is a nursing home case. This poor woman suffered some of the most extreme abuse, physical, psychological, sexual abuse I've ever heard. It's the worst case I've ever encountered. And the doctor who took care of the patient acknowledged that he knew what was going on and he did nothing to protect her because he wanted to protect her livelihood. And I remember thinking this is as close to a slam dunk case as I had. And we lost the case. And I couldn't understand why. And we polled the foreperson. The plaintiff was African American. The defendant was an African doctor. The foreperson was an African American civil engineer from the University of Chicago who worked for the city of Chicago. And I asked him, I said, how did you decide the outcome of this case? You heard the testimony from the doctor. And he said, what's with you white people always picking on us black professionals? And it dawned on me, this was no longer an issue of just race. This was an issue of class. And the quality of our health care is being affected by the class systems that we have in place. And we always need to keep that in mind. If you look at the PowerPoint that I put up, one of the items that we've encountered here is with institutions taking advantage of minorities. And it's not just along racial lines, but it's along class lines. We just finished a case, Mike and I had a trial along with a number of the other lawyers in the office, where a doctor was sexually molesting his patients, hundreds of patients. Almost all of them were either black, brown, or poor women. And the commonality that he thought he had is that they wouldn't speak out. We see that taking place throughout the country, where poor people are taken advantage of because they won't speak out. And unfortunately, in our healthcare system, we see that as a continuing theme. There's an idea that if people will not believe you if you are poor. The concept that runs through all of this is this idea of bias, inherent bias, that Tony and I see playing out through all of our cases. You take a case that goes to trial, and you have a battle back and forth between the lawyers and the judges, where one of the issues is who's going to sit on your jury. We had a case recently, a medical malpractice case, where the plaintiff was Hispanic, and the defense struck 6 of the jurors in a row because they were all Hispanic. Fortunately for us, our judge saw through it, and he reinstated those jurors pursuant to a Supreme Court case called Batson. Let me tell you the opposite side of that. Many years ago, Tony represented an individual. It was a police case. An individual was chased by the police. The police officer put a gun in the individual's mouth and said, "Tell me where all the guns are." This individual said, "I don't know where the guns are, but I'll tell you where the drugs are." The police officer let him go. The following day, our client went to the police station and made a complaint. Shockingly, the police took it seriously, performed a DNA search check on the gun, and found our client's DNA all over his gun. There was a criminal prosecution. And at the criminal case, it was a bench trial. And that judge acquitted the police officer under the rationale that you couldn't rule out how the DNA got on the gun. So what's the point between those two cases? The individual discretion that a judge has based on their inherent bias impacts all of these cases. And we see it in the healthcare industry as well. You see individual doctors and how they treat their patients. There are studies that show that black physicians are much more effective at diagnosing and treating black patients. And that's true for Hispanic physicians, Asian physicians, and it all has to do with their inherent and implicit bias. So one of the challenges that we have is fixing that. We didn't get any help from our Supreme Court recently when they struck down the ability of universities to grant affirmative action and bring in more minority physicians and more minority professionals. So there's a huge challenge because we do not have enough black and brown individuals in our city and our country that are representing those communities, whether it's in the courtroom or in the healthcare industry. We have 3 guests that are with us tonight, this afternoon, that I'd like to introduce, who are going to give you their perspective and their take on what they're doing to try and fix those inequalities in the healthcare system. The first is Dr. Ngozi Ezike, if you could stand up. Most of you recognize Dr. Ezike, I believe, because of her role that she served for the city in the Illinois Department of Public Health during our COVID crisis. Currently, she's the president and CEO of Sinai Chicago, the state's largest private safety net health system. We also have with us Dr. Enrico Benedetti. Dr. Benedetti, if you could, thank you. Dr. Benedetti is a transplant surgeon and head of surgery at the University of Illinois. He's a prominent leader in organ transplantation and the use of robotic-assisted techniques. And he leads an annual conference at the University of Illinois on public health and the challenges that are being done to make progress in this area. We also have with us Nicole Milbrook. Nicole? Nicole is the Chief Program Officer at Youth Guidance, a professor and community leader with more than 25 years of clinical experience with adults and families and youth in various settings. Her organization helps break cycles of violence, overcomes life and academic obstacles, makes positive choices, and stays on the path to success. We also have my partner, Mike Holden. Mike has worked with me on a number of our malpractice cases and malpractice issues. And I think what Mike's going to try and do is he's going to give you an overlay or an idea of some of the experiences that he's had in the courtroom that relate to the issues of inherent bias along socioeconomic and racial issues. Mike?
So we as attorneys, and specifically, well, I guess all attorneys, both on the medical malpractice side and the civil rights side, we are in a unique position that we really only see people who... There it goes.
We really only see people after they suffer an adverse and often tragic event. And one thing that we see over and over again on the medical malpractice side is that those people are disproportionately minority. And the effects of race in healthcare, and especially in medical legal cases, tend to be multifactorial. As Stefan suggested, many of these factors are linked to the reality that African Americans and other minorities are disproportionately represented in lower socioeconomic classes. And when I was asked to speak on this topic, one of the first things I did was to see what studies have been done to look at this issue. And there's been a number of studies that have been done over the last 20 years that have looked at race in healthcare, and have found that there's a number of areas where race impacts the type, the frequency, the quality of healthcare that minorities receive. And as Stefan suggested, the most prevalent is simply access to healthcare. Minorities face a number of barriers in accessing healthcare and quality, and specifically quality healthcare. Lack of insurance leads to an inability for those patients to receive care, and when they do receive care, pay for that care. This leads to patients delaying care because they can't afford it, and it leads to medical debt. There's studies that show that minorities are disproportionately saddled with debt due to healthcare treatment. There's also a lack of continuity of care. We see it over and over again with our clients that minority patients are less likely to have a regular care provider. These same patients often rely on the ER as their family care doctor. Anything that comes up, they go to the ER. They don't go to their family doctor. And really how this affects them is it affects their ability to have access to specialists for the care they actually need. Because what they do is they show up in the ER basically tells them there's nothing imminently wrong with you, follow up with your primary care physician, and they don't go back to a doctor until they go to the ER again. And perhaps the largest impact is simply the availability of quality care. The harsh reality is that minority patients have less access to higher quality care, largely based on the quality of facilities available in their communities. You think of Chicago and its high quality facilities like the University of Northwestern, University of Chicago, UIC, Loyola, all of those areas, all of those hospitals largely cater to white population. The patients who go to the hospitals on the south and west side, the small local community hospitals, go to hospitals that are underfunded, understaffed, and generally just of lower reputation. One of the other overarching factors that impacts racial bias in healthcare is patient-provider communication and an unconscious bias that comes along with that. The race and ethnicity of both the patient and the doctor can affect their ability to communicate, both in the language they speak, the manner in which they communicate, and really just understanding each other. And Stefan mentioned a case we took to trial last year with the Batson challenges of jurors. There was another issue in that case that was a significant issue. And that case involved a little boy who underwent heart surgery and ended up paralyzed due to a spinal cord infarct that occurred during the surgery. And the hospital and doctors involved, their position was it didn't occur during the surgery because the boy wasn't paralyzed after the surgery. And mom was adamant that she talked to the doctors and told the doctors as soon as the little boy woke up after surgery and multiple times throughout that admission that he wasn't moving his lower legs, his lower extremities. And the doctors didn't document it. The nurses didn't document it. There were contrary documentations of whether he could actually move his legs. And what that shows is that it's not that she didn't say it, is that they either didn't care or didn't believe her. And that's all too frequent in healthcare, especially with minority patients. A patient's race and ethnicity also can influence how they present symptoms and how their care providers recognize them. For example, a 2016 study found that white medical students and residents who endorse false beliefs about black people's tolerance to pain rated the black patient's pain as lower than the white patient's pain based on the same symptoms, and that showed bias in their pain treatment recommendations for black people. Additionally, according to the lead author of a 2024 study published in the BMJ Quality and Safety Journal, women and racial and ethnic minorities are 20 to 30% more likely than white men to experience a misdiagnosis. And underpinning all of this is a mistrust of the healthcare system that exists in the minority communities. Black Americans have a history of mistrust of the healthcare system. You can look back in history, and from 1931 to 1971, there was a unconsensual study done in Tuskegee where syphilis patients were denied treatment to see what the long-term effects of the disease were. In 1951, Henrietta Lacks cervical cells were harvested without her consent and used to create a line of cells that has continued to be used for bioresearch today. A 2023 Pew study found that 51% of Black Americans surveyed said the healthcare system was designed to hold them back. 55% of Black Americans surveyed believed that the medical researchers continue to experiment on Black people without their knowledge or consent. All of this is to say that the racial disparities continue to persist in our system, and the challenges that these challenges create an environment where minorities, including Black Americans, are disproportionately represented in medical legal cases. A few of the cases, I'm going to try to move through them quickly, but a few of the cases our office is either currently working on or has worked on. In Ohio, a young woman went to a laboratory that held itself out as being an affordable laboratory for green card exams. And a laboratory technician at that lab, and again, this was used largely by African immigrants for their green cards, was sexually assaulted. And what we've come to find out is that records in the case show that there were at least 2 prior complaints about sexual misconduct that went unaddressed, and that the lab itself had inadequate policies and procedures to properly protect its disproportionately minority patient population. In Chicago, this is a case Stefan touched on, Latasha Mims was a 36-year-old woman who suffered from psychosis and dementia. She was admitted to a Southside nursing home, and during her nearly 2 years at the facility, her weight dwindled to nearly 60 pounds. She had gangrenous toes and feet, deteriorating teeth, rashes, bed sores, slept on linen soiled with both human and rodent waste, and was sexually assaulted during her stay. And ultimately, this mistreatment led to her death. In Arkansas, a facility that claimed to provide rehabilitation and mental health services for troubled youth, knowingly exposed these youths to a sexual predator over the course of decades. The majority of these residents were young black youth from Chicago area that were sent there to keep them away from the dangers they faced on city streets. And these are just a few examples about how minorities and black Americans are disproportionately put in a position to be victims of poor medical care, medical malpractice, and even sexual abuse within our medical community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So, Dr. Benedetti, from up here, I saw you, as Mike is describing some of our cases, I could see you wince a little bit. And I know that there's always a tension between doctors and lawyers in talking about medical malpractice. And one of the great things about your role and your experience at UIC is the work that you've done to try and prevent some of these things from happening in the minority settings at the UIC. And I know you're going to talk to us about the advances and the roles that you have played and that UIC has played in bringing minorities into the community to make sure that these kinds of things do not persist. Dr. Benedetti?
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Antonio. Well, you may wonder why a transplant surgeon that worked in Chicago for over 30 years is interested in this particular topic. That's not typically our cup of tea. Well, it goes back when I started my training at the University of Illinois in July '89. University of Illinois was assigned to cover Stroger, back then county hospital. And I was in the emergency department in a month rotation. And I was asked to be in charge of the women room. There was a room in the emergency room then where women would come for care. Now, keep in mind that I'm Italian. I came from a system that has socialized medicine, where healthcare is available to everybody to this day. Well, around 2 a.m., a young woman, African-American, came to me in this room and was a woman that was pregnant, uncomplicated pregnancy, 4th month, no problem. She had waited 19 hours to see me, that I was absolutely incompetent in OB-GYN since I'm a surgeon. And I thought, how is it possible that a country so great like the US allows citizens to suffer such a discrepancy in attention, right? I think it's a God-given right for a woman to have routine care during pregnancy. And since then, I've always been focusing on this problem. I invite Antonio to our symposium on healthcare, and over 18 editions, we went through most of the medical disease that you can think of. And I guarantee you that there is, each of them, minority get the short end of the stick. There is not a single disease where they don't do worse than Caucasian counterpart. And of course, that's depressing and should be fought. But I believe that progress has been made. And I've been lucky to work at the University of Illinois. I think it's different. I slightly disagree with you. 55% of my patients are African-American, 30% are Latino, and the balance are Caucasian. So University of Illinois, cooperating with hospitals like Sinai, provide tertiary quaternary care to mostly minority inner city patients in Illinois. And I've been blessed to work in an institution that in over 30 years has always allowed me to care for everybody, regardless of the ability to pay. And I think it's a great pride for me to be part of that institution. So what got better over the years? Well, early in my career, we had a lot of patients coming to University of Illinois without any insurance. I think the first step is to provide everybody with an insurance. In March 2010, Obamacare was passed. And please note that the percent of people with health insurance in the US went 10 points higher. In a country of 330 million, that's over 30 million people that access health care. This is a formidable progress, because if you don't even have health insurance, how can you possibly be cared for? Now there is all host of problems that you touch that I agree, but without even access to health care, you are damned to be not taken care for, right? Now maybe some of you know which one is the state in the union that has the lowest rate of covered life with any insurance. Anybody wants to try? They're close by, but Texas, 27% of the people to this day still uninsured. This is because Obamacare, that is a great law, was not adopted by many states, despite the fact that most of the bill would be paid 100% in the first year by federal government, 95% the second, 90% of the bill forever after. Look at Illinois. We can be proud of the state where we live. Only 6% of the people in the state of Illinois actually are not covered by any insurance. This is a great credit, because 6% is almost physiological, and most of the people are patients that are young, don't want to spend on the insurance, and they pretty much try to go without it, which is not a good idea, by the way. So a lot of progress due to intelligent legislation that has allowed many citizens, especially in states run like Illinois' compassionate way, to have the insurance. Jennifer asked me, what else we need to do? Well, I think that we have the insurance. We do not have the quality of care available to everybody that we need. I come from a country that has a life expectancy of 85 years, 84.4. The United States, which is the superpower in medicine, responsible for 19 out of 20 of significant medical progress in the last 15 years, are beautiful hospital, the best care, the most advanced, 79. Now, you know that there is a study from Yale that showed that the life expectancy in Streeterville, downtown Chicago, is 90 years, higher than almost anywhere in the world. The top is Japan, 85.2. Yeah. Well, but if you go to Edgewater, to back of the, it's only 60%. Can you believe it? 4 miles south of downtown Chicago, people have a life expectancy 30 years shorter. And they have insurance. So what's the missing link? I think the missing link is health maintenance and prevention. And that's where I think hospitals like Sinai can really do much, but you got to be more capillary, got to be all over the state, certainly all over the city. We are very good, and I feel part of this great country as much as any of you, in taking care of acute problem. You have a terrible disaster, you have a dissected aortic aneurysm, you want to be in Chicago, you want to be in Illinois. But in terms of prevention of care, we are still behind. There is a lot of lack of care for basic disease like diabetes, like hypertension. Chronic renal failure is not diagnosed early enough. And those are diseases that affect minority in a very high proportion, higher than Caucasian. So that's where we hope that we can make a difference. And I know that many people in the room are as passionate as I am, and progress will be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Benedetti. Dr. Ezeki is going to talk to us a little bit about her lessons, what she learned from her experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, and then shift to discuss the role of race and ethnicity in healthcare. Dr. Ezike?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to be here. And I want to echo everything that Dr. Benedetti, my good friend, has said. Thinking back to COVID, there were lessons that were learned, but I would say that they weren't really new lessons. We know that in any kind of crisis, the persons, the communities, the neighborhoods that will be most affected will be those that are the most vulnerable. And we can look very clearly at maps and guess ahead of time who those communities, where those communities are. And so in the case of this emergency specifically, we had a virus that preyed on individuals that had chronic diseases. And we already know the groups that have higher rates of chronic diseases, whether it's diabetes or asthma or cardiovascular disease. Those are our minority populations. And so we saw COVID really, it ravaged the whole world, but did an extra disservice to people who already had these conditions, which were in high numbers people of minority backgrounds. And so after already having the life expectancy, which is already low compared to other developed countries, already having that life expectancy decrease for the first time in 2019, it was reported due to the opioid crisis. We now had the COVID crisis, which further depressed life expectancy for the whole country, but again, not even more so for communities of color. And so we've seen yet a widening disparity following COVID. I think what's important to acknowledge, which we maybe touched on, but we need to highlight, we talked about the police officers, and there was some mention of doctors and bias. I would argue that maybe there's not that much in common between a police officer with bias and a doctor with bias. And of course, we don't want to use that broad brush and paint all police officers, all physicians, but the instances that we see are due to an issue that we have that's much more upstream than with individuals, and it's a bias that's been permeating since the origin of this country. And so understanding where this has come from is very important, because a lot of the fallout that we're seeing now is because of the origins. And so there were bias that has been legislated from the beginning of this country. The fact that we have communities that are so distinct from other communities in the city of Chicago is not happenstance. There were federal housing programs that dictated where people were going to end up and led to disinvestment in some communities, and creating opportunities for people to move to the suburbs and denying loans to other populations to even build any of that wealth and the consequent generational wealth. So I just want to make sure that we're framing this to see how we got here, because it's those specific pieces that relate to how we're here and need to go back to it to figure out some of the solutions, which obviously involve having people understand the importance of equity, but also involve our legislative partners and leaders to make sure that we're creating the opportunities that allow people to thrive. We are very clear that the issues that result in people being able to live their best health and not live only 64 years or 65 years when you have neighbors a few miles down the road living 85 and 90 years, have as much to do with what happens outside of the hospital and the clinic as it does what happens within. And so there has to be a multi-pronged approach to take on the inequities and the inequalities that we're hopefully all wanting to see changed. And so that involves investing in communities as much as investing into our healthcare facilities. But we do see that healthcare facilities like Sinai Chicago are actually some of the victim of bias because some of the aesthetics lead to perceptions that may not be as accurate. We know that the ability to reinvest and to have all the upgraded technologies is based on having some margin. But when you have 60-70% of the patients are on Medicaid and a significant number of uninsured, and we're upholding our century-long tradition of not turning anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay, not performing a wallet biopsy to understand who can pay and how much, and have that determine how much care or how much care is not given. Because we don't do that, that leads us to getting the designations and the awards of being fourth in the nation in terms of the percentage of our revenues are donated to charitable care and community benefit. We did $50 million in charity care last year alone. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I would say that if we really are serious, even just focusing on building a healthier Chicago, it does involve a lot of partnership. Your healthy city will only be as healthy as your sickest community. And if we know where those sick communities are because of generations of unequal and inappropriate policies, then it would behoove us to go back to those same communities and work on the economic development and empowerment and support that's necessary to reverse these very long trends. We know that housing, we know that, as we said, specifically chronic diseases, we know that diabetes is a major killer that goes on to cause very, significant additional morbidity, can result in end-stage kidney disease, can result in people being on dialysis. Someone on dialysis being connected to a machine 5 days, 3 days a week for 4 or 5 hours each time becomes a very difficult, challenging to be a productive member of society in the workforce or otherwise. And so how do we work on those upstream, I'm wearing my public health hat, upstream solutions? Telling someone how to prevent diabetes involves eating the right foods, being able to be active. That becomes a very challenging prescription to give someone when there isn't a grocery store in the neighborhood. Seated in North Lawndale, where Mount Sinai, our flagship hospital, is, there is no grocery store in the neighborhood. Safe spaces are an issue. When you're telling people to walk and they're saying, I don't feel comfortable, it's not safe to walk. Those are the things that have to be addressed upstream if we want to get to the downstream results and be able to make those changes. We also know that you can't, a safety net hospital such as us, and we are the largest private safety net health system in the city of Chicago, and we want to continue to fulfill our mission, but we can't go it alone. There's an African proverb that I love to cite, that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go with others. And so really what we need is partnership. We need to have people lock arms with Sinai's and the other safety nets to be able to uplift and create the additional resources that are necessary to serve the people that need the most. We can't do the one-size-fits-all because we know that there are specific needs that need to be addressed. And health equity doesn't mean just giving everybody the same thing. It means looking to see what the actual need is and providing that. And so we know that there's a lot of incredibly well-resourced health systems right here in our great city of Chicago. And we know that there are other other entities like Sinai Chicago that struggle to attract that same kind of support. But I would argue that the impact and the need is much greater, and in fact, those dollars can go much further. So we are looking to be able to find additional partners that can allow us to lift up the communities that need it most. Some exciting things that we're doing that will help move the needle are projects such as community health worker initiatives. We heard about the improved effects that are achieved when there is linguistic concordance, when there's cultural competency, and people who seem to be, who understand the community. And so community health workers are part of the healthcare team that allow people in the community to be employed, allow people in the community to be a part of the healthcare system, and make a difference. These people will speak the language, will look like the people. We have been training community health workers for the last 10 to 20 years, and we have seen dramatic positive effects. One great example is that community health workers, most do not have a college education. They have a GED or a high school diploma, but they are trained in specific areas. And so, for instance, those who were trained around asthma, they were tasked with going into the homes of patients after they were discharged from an asthma hospitalization. And from those in-home visits, ensuring that the 2 inhalers had been picked up, ensuring that they knew which was the emergency inhaler, which was the maintenance inhaler, ensuring that they had a follow-up appointment, just that warm touch from a trusted member of the community that was acting as an agent of the health system, they were able to decrease asthma readmission rates by 40%. And so we're trying to upscale this initiative because it's a win-win, which you rarely get these days. You're giving someone an important job with a livable wage, with insurance for them and their family, and you're allowing them to be extenders of the healthcare team working in community to promote the health of the very community that they're from. And so as we extend that program and look for more innovative and exciting ways to use these extenders of the healthcare team, you know, we're putting them with the maternal baby unit. We're putting them with the behavioral health areas. And so we think that there are many ways that we can extend this because we are aware of the significant healthcare workforce shortage. I lift up this because I think it's one of the greatest programs that we have that move the needle on health equity. I think that at the end of the day, we have to all agree, and I'm not sure that there's firm agreement, probably in this room, but healthcare is supposed to be a fundamental right, and it's not supposed to be a privilege. So this really is a matter of justice, health justice. And so being able to look at the areas of the greatest areas of injustice and be able to go in surgically to those areas and be able to make a difference, that's how we're going to lift up those communities, which will inevitably benefit the entire city of Chicago and all cities that have these, you know, urban or rural areas that are the most impacted, to give them the appropriate resources to lift up those areas and the bigger community as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ezeki. Nicole Millbrook is going to speak to you about the role of mental health and her work in this space and how it's impacted, the role of race has been impacted in this area. Nicole?
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great. First, I am so excited that mental health is a part of this panel on healthcare. That's amazing beyond belief, because there was a time where a mental health professional wouldn't be on a panel like this as it relates to healthcare. That to me just speaks to decreasing the stigma of mental health to begin with. And I would love for us to start to think of mental health similarly to the way that we think of physical health. People look at mental health, think about mental health, and they think about mental illness. So they think about a mentally ill person, and there's like, ooh, there's stigma to that. Nobody wants to be that. So I just want to frame it similarly to the way that we frame regular physical illness. There's no stigma to getting the flu, right? Anybody can get it. Anybody can get the flu. So I want you all to think about mental illness similarly to that. It is simply when your stressors outweigh your coping mechanisms currently. And that can happen to anybody at any given time. How it shows up may look different. For some people, it may be a depressive episode. For some, it may be an anxiety attack. But it is simply your current stressors outweigh your current coping strategies. And when we think of it that way, it's not such a scary thing, I hope. So you may be asking, what does this have to do with race disparities in mental health? I'm also happy that a conversation about youth and mental health is on here because young people get left out of the conversation a lot. We find the race disparities in mental health as well. There are much higher rates of mental health conditions in Black and brown individuals. And what that looks like is people of color being undertreated but overdiagnosed, if that makes any sense. So over-pathologized, so when you do get treated, you're gonna get seen as there's something wrong with you more often than just life happened and your stressors outweighed your coping strategies, but undertreated. Less likely to get access. So we've already heard about, the healthcare deserts. There are mental health care deserts as well. And even when the facilities exist, the access isn't always there. That includes healthcare access, that includes long waiting lists. That even includes, once you get there, what does it feel like? How easy is it to go through the process? To get your appointment, to follow through on an appointment. It can just be really difficult. It can be difficult for a family, and let's add the stigma. There are so many things. So there are lower rates of treatment, and then there's the disparities in the quality of treatment. This has been changing over the years, but there are less and less practitioners of color, not as many people who do mental health services that look like Black and brown individuals who may seek out treatment. And I'm really happy that some of the stigma has started to decrease a bit since the pandemic, and we're seeing more and more Black and brown individuals seeking mental health treatment. When they get there, they don't necessarily see people who speak their language, who look like them, who sound like them, and understand their experience. And we've already heard a little bit about over-surveillance practices in many fields. That includes the child welfare system that's not represented anywhere. That leads to a distrust in systems. And when you distrust systems, that includes all of the systems. So signing up for mental health treatment, that distrust transfers to that system as well. So it can be really difficult to sign up, get there, have the appointment, and then somebody tells you, oh, I'd like you to come every week. Oh, I think you should try this medication. And it's like, I want to, but I don't know, maybe, can I trust you? I don't know. It can become really, really difficult. It's a lot easier when you're looking at somebody who understands your experience, though, which is why it's so important to have people in the field who mirror the experience of people who are seeking treatment. so important that we have more people enter the field who come from diverse backgrounds. So add all those things together, and you have got a lot of risk factors that make it difficult to access treatment. And one more thing I want to add is that about young people is Black and brown young people are not often seen as vulnerable youth. They're often seen as older than they are. Thank you, trouble. Trouble. Older than they are, more responsible than they are, not necessarily needing to be protected. So, not seen as vulnerable all the time. You can go, oh, thank you. So I want to tell you a little bit about youth guidance, our organization and our approach, because I was told to talk about solutions, so I'm going to talk about solutions. One of the ways that we handle this and deal with the stigma is that we have an approach to providing mental health and mentoring services to youth and families by first starting with young people, because it is much easier to enter a community and a family through youth. Little less stigma to treat young people than adults. So starting with youth is the approach that we take. And kids spend most of their time at school. So we meet them where they are. They're at school, and we build the services right into their school day. And you don't have to be like, we don't want them pulled out like you're in trouble. Like the IEP services, you get pulled out, right? You're diagnosed, there's something wrong, and you get pulled out. Ours are slightly different than that. It's almost like you joined a club. So we want to destigmatize it that way. So serving kids where they are in school removes the barrier for the parent. They're at no cost to the family, so that removes a financial barrier. Parents do have to consent because it is a mental health service after all, but they don't have to go through appointments and transportation barriers and getting a kid to a clinic because their kid is already at school. So they just have to, they know about the service, they hear about it, they consent to it, and their kid goes to school, and it's part of their school day. The other thing is, these services are designed to be culturally responsive. We purposely hire staff who are from the communities that we serve. And our flagship is in Chicago, so we started in Chicago, and we are in over 160 Chicago public schools and a bunch of suburban schools and Lake County schools. But we are also in several states across the United States and in London. So it's a replicable model. We're in Boston, Los Angeles, Seattle, Dallas, Kansas City. Which one am I missing? DC, Pittsburgh. Did I get all of them? Okay. And continuing to replicate in other places. So it's a replicable model. We hire staff from the communities that we're serving. We also look for something that we call a coolness factor. And this is just in youth development. Whenever you're looking for people to work with young people, you need people who can connect with young people. And it's a thing that is really hard to describe, but it is, kids are drawn to it. Youth culture is a culture all by itself. So when you talk about being culturally responsive, it isn't just ethnicity and language, it's also youth culture. And it isn't necessarily, oh, you know who all the rappers are. It is, there's a thing. Like we've got clinicians on our staff who are in their 60s, but kids connect with them because they've got the thing. So we look for that. It's the coolness factor, like kids connect with them. But yeah, we've got kids wear shirts. They wear the shirts. They proudly wear them through school like they're in a club. So that's one of the ways we destigmatize. They do not have to hide and like, oh, I'm in therapy. I'm embarrassed about it. Nobody should know you're going to this appointment. Nope, you wear your shirt proudly. I am learning the skills that I need. Why? Because I need to build more coping strategies. Because there's only two ways that you manage your mental health. You increase the coping strategies and or decrease the stressors. Because that's what mentally healthy people do. So these kids are doing that in these groups with their peers. They become leaders in their schools. where they facilitate destigmatizing mental health with the other kids in their school. They become kind of beacons of this is what we do, this is what we learn. We learn these things and we teach it to other kids. The last thing that I want you all to know about these programs and this approach is that it's evidence-based. Our two biggest programs are BAM, Becoming a Man, and WOW, Working on Womanhood. And both have had randomized controlled trials, so both are evidence-based and have got rigorous research behind them. They've been replicated, and we know they work. And I'll just give you a couple of the stats for each, and then we can talk a little bit about funding. So for WOW, when girls enter WOW, what we found in the research study, 38% of them endorsed symptoms of PTSD. That's more than war veterans when they come home. Just let that sink in. 38% symptoms of PTSD. After a year, 22% decrease in symptoms in PTSD, just going to this program once a week. 14% decrease in depressive symptoms and 9% decrease in anxiety symptoms. In the Becoming a Man program, 82% improved trust and critical thinking skills. Four out of 5 BAM students improve relationships with their peers and with adults. These are the kind of things that help kids go really far in life, that help them be able to build those coping strategies needed in order to be just mentally healthy individuals as they grow up. And, okay, let's talk a little bit about funding. What does it cost, right? So it costs about between $2,300 and $2,500 per year per student to do these programs. And in the Becoming a Man study the University of Chicago did, they predicted that it saved about $75,000 to put one student through the Becoming a Man program by spending $2,500 to send somebody through the program for a year. Talk about an upstream public health approach. But despite all this evidence, here's the thing with nonprofits. We always struggle with funding. Always. Like, we just experienced a 40% reduction in our state funding, causing us to have to pull out of several schools this year. About 1,000 kids who got this service last year won't get it this year as a result of funding. And I only say that in a space like this because I know that there are elected officials in the room and there are people here who can potentially make a change to that. He left. Yeah, I think it's just important. I think it's important that people know that, though. I think it's important that people know that as we talk about solutions and we talk about creating culturally responsive solutions to these problems, we've got the solutions. We're not the only programs that do this, that do things like this, but we've got a good one. We serve a lot of youth. It's scalable, it's replicable. We do really good work. And the only problem really is funding. And the funding is shaky, right? We ride this ebb and flow. I mean, we've got our Senior Director of Development is sitting right over there, the person who raises the funds, her team. And then we've got Rich, who is our private fundraiser as well. Like, they work so hard raising funds for us because they just have to keep doing it. They have to work so hard raising funds, and it's just really sad that we have to work this hard. in order to keep these services free to these families. That's the access issue. So I'll stop there because I'm sure there are questions for all of us. Thanks, everybody.
Nicole, I have a quick question for you. What are you optimistic about in your space?
I'm optimistic about the young people. They're the bright spot. I'm also optimistic about the work that we do. I mean, our staff are well-trained and do really good work. And I'm also optimistic about, we work with a generation of kids who, when it comes to social emotional learning, this is gonna sound weird to say, but from an emotional intelligence perspective, this generation of kids is looking to be more emotionally intelligent than their parents. And we see it play out sometimes where kids are learning these skills and then they get into an argument with their parents and they're processing feelings and the parents are like, what? Because they just had not been taught to do that. Like our generations hadn't been taught to do that. So that's, yeah, I'm optimistic about that because that just tells me we're taking a turn as it relates to mental health and social emotional learning.
Thank you. Dr. Ezeki, I'm going to play devil's advocate with you for a minute. You made a statement that I happen to agree with, but I want to challenge you on it. For those, you said that healthcare is a fundamental human right. It's a fundamental right that we are all entitled to equal healthcare. Not everybody in this country agrees with that. A number of people in this country think that it should be merit-based, that if you don't have the money, you're not entitled to it. What would you say to those people?
I think you have to appeal to a different argument for people that feel like that, and I think there is one. I can't change what people think is deserved by everyone, but I think for those people who obviously, thinking about the greater good is not in their DNA, I think you can also appeal to the fact that you cannot have a thriving community if you don't have healthy, productive citizens, members of that community. And so whether you are running a business or you're looking for talented people to work with you, for you, if you don't have a healthy base, a very sick person with all of these conditions, it's very hard to be a good student. It's very hard to be a good employee. It's very hard to be a productive member of society. So even just for a self-serving goal, you benefit from having a healthier community. And I hope that maybe that more selfish kind of bent is still something that people can think about, that, yeah, I need healthy employees. I need people who are not calling off. I need people that I can count on to show up. That's still important for a thriving community and economy as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Benedetti, I'd like to end with you. You threw up a graph that just blew me away. Your graph showed that as a result of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, over 92% of the United States now has health insurance. And then you gave the example of Texas, which has not implemented the Affordable Care Act. What would you say to Texas?
Well, many people don't understand fully Obamacare. Obamacare, of course, provided for people over 130% poverty line, ability to have access to private insurance, this marketplace insurance. But the big difference has been done by expanding the entitlement to Medicaid, right? So it used to be up to 100% Medicaid poverty line. Now it's got to 130%. In a state like Illinois, we had more than 1 million people. So now we have almost 2.8 million covered by Medicaid. So figure out a state like Texas that refused to do the expansion. Then pretty much the law is empty, has no more effect, because the people that need the most, the people that have income for a family of 4 of less than $45,000, they cannot have access to health care, right? So that's the problem with Texas. They refused the expansion of the Medicaid entitlement up to under 30%, which to me, from one of the richest states in the union, is an act of cruelty.
It's an act of cruelty for one of the richest states in the union. And I think our panel will end on that note. And I'd ask Tony if he could give some closing remarks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Stefan. You know, as a matter of note, we haven't gone much over our time, so I appreciate those who remained and stayed. I know that your time is valuable. The Attorney General had to leave for a flight. But I hope you found this as successful as I did today, because, look, I already have a number of takeaways from today. Number one, that we have way too many deserts that exist in our city or in our cities, whether it's a food desert, a news desert, a medical desert. Number two, that we are acutely, chronically, and I'm using those words intentionally, that we are acutely and chronically poor on preventative care medicine. If we are better with preventative care, we save lives. That justice does not only involve policing, that it includes health justice, mental health justice. That's how these two tables come together. If we improve health and mental health justice, we know that 40% of the people who are shot by police are usually as a result of mental health disturbances. They're emotionally disturbed people, EDPs. Look at the lives that we can save. The takeaway is that we have to continue to embrace our youth, right? Because if we don't embrace our youth, what happens then is they become bad adults. They become very, very difficult adults. Number five, they're all over the place. Oh, no, number five is that we have to change the narrative, right? When we hear something that we know is wrong, it's our responsibility to change the narrative. Number six, that our state is committed to justice for all. And number seven, I wrote a question mark here, and this is why. And this is more for Nicole, possibly. There is active litigation in the country that is now titled troubled teen litigation. Listening to you, I'm thinking, well, that's not right, is it? Are we stigmatizing people when we say that? But it's actually titled, Come Listen to Our Troubled Teen Litigation. And now I'm wondering, I go, listening to you, it's not the right way to do it. We have to work against stigmatizing that. So thank you for bringing that to light. So what's our job in this room when we leave here? When we leave here, we have to talk, we have to advocate, we have to legislate, we have to litigate, we have to do whatever we have to do in order to take away what we have learned today. We're very grateful for you all to have made a difference or try to make a difference in our community, whether it's citywide, statewide, or nationwide. Are there any other questions or comments from anybody? Because if not, we can wrap up. Perry, please.
I'm president and CEO of the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. And that Education Center piece is part of a name change or rebranding that we did 2 or 3 years ago. And the reason being is that we are, as a museum, museums are the most trusted entities and institutions in the nation, you know, beyond one's own family, right, and friends. And for the DuSable Museum especially, since we are the oldest independent Black History Museum in the nation, we are that trusted entity and venue. And Tony knows when he and his colleague came to, Ben Crump came to the DuSable for a wonderful program on justice, on policing, that we have an incredible audience that we have access to. And I'm really big on breaking down silos, right? And speaking against traditional sort of impressions and perceptions of what things are, right? So you may not think of a museum as a place to address some of these issues, but we really are because of our concentration on education and public education and reaching our communities, right? We are much more likely to get a larger group of attendees when DuSable makes the invitation than when a university makes an invitation or a political group makes an invitation. And so I'm seeing so much overlap. And Jen, you mentioned the Venn diagram. It's making my head spin, right? Because there are so many issues that we can pull in with our audiences at the DuSable, which is also located on the south side, across the street from the University of Chicago hospitals. And I myself am a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, and I want to say hi to Professor Fetterman, but he escaped. But it's a unique opportunity, and I really like to talk with you, Tony and Jen, about how we start to convene some of these partnerships, because the partnerships are essential, and trusted partnerships are even more essential. During COVID, we had some web-based offerings, right, on mental health, on the pandemic, and we brought up the same issues that were brought up about the Tuskegee experiments and Henrietta Lacks. And there are reasons why the Black community mistrusts medical services and mistrusts vaccines. On the law enforcement side, my goodness, how can we send police out into communities they know nothing about? Nothing, right? They need to understand the history of our communities, the racism and the segregation of Chicago, and they need to understand that history in order to properly do their jobs in our communities, in order to create that respect, right, for those that they're trusted with to serve and protect and not disrespect, right? And so the training of officers, the training of medical students, all of these conversations can be had in a much more informal setting at the museum, right? And I think much more participatory conversations. One of my trustees is with Gift of Hope. So Dr. Benedetti, there are conversations around why so few Black people donate their organs. Why are there so many misunderstandings and lack of information on organ donorship, even with our wonderful Secretary of State Jesse White starting the organ donation program. So many opportunities to partner. I know a lot of other people here who we can certainly partner with, but I want you to just think differently about a museum, differently about a community organization, and how much more power there is in leveraging our history as a history museum to get to the people who need the information most.
Well, you have
And I thank you, Tony, for this presentation.
You have a partner in us. Thank you. And Jeanette.
So when I had my opportunity to speak, there's something that I didn't share with you guys, just for the sake of time. So since 2021, I've been working with a group of Black women, older women in the city of Chicago around an ordinance that would help us to reduce trauma and actually hold police accountable for how they interact with the Black and brown community. It's called the Anjanette Young Ordinance. If you just throw that in Google, it'll pop up. There's a page that SEIU union worked with me to create, and that information is still there. But I say that because I'm in a room of legislators, like that is something that I am still working on. And so when you think about what happened to me and what I've learned over the 5 years is that there is 50 plus other families in the city of Chicago who've had the very same similar experience that I've had. And then when we fast forward, when we got Sonia Massey down in Springfield on the farther end of the state, we need to pass some real concrete legislation that will hold police accountable for how they interact with the Black and brown community. And so I am still actively pushing that. I can care less if it's called Internet Young, Sonia Massey, whatever it's called. I'm more concerned about putting tangible things in place that we can concretely hold police accountable for, and so that you don't have another Sonia Massey case when the officer has bounced around from department to department, and then yet he's still, you know, harming people. And we have officers right here in the city of Chicago who continues to harm on the streets of Chicago, and they've had more than 10 misconduct complaints, but yet we're still paying them to protect and serve a community that they're actually harming. So I would love to be able to speak to anybody that's interested that can help me move the needle on this, because I am committed to making that change, whether it's here in the city of Chicago, whether it's on the state level, maybe both, and even in Washington when we're looking at the George Ford Police Accountability Act. Like, we need to put some real things in place that can hold police accountable.
Well, thank you all, everyone. Appreciate your time. And oh, one more. Oh, one.
Not a question, but a thank you.
Yes.
To you all. I've been sitting here in awe. I'm over a group of Black women pastors, and for you to include the faith community in this discussion, I tell you, my life has been changed. And I just want to say personally a thank you to both of you all for having the vision, and to each of the panelists. We were praying for you when you didn't even know. We've been praying, and so I just want to continue to ask and thank Cecilia. Oh my God, my life has changed, and I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you. You have truly made a difference in people's lives today, so God bless you.
That's the greatest takeaway for today. Thank you all very much. God bless. Have a good day.